From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. It is a cash windfall for the state and cities and towns. More than $1 billion coming from the American Recovery Act to Rhode Island. Take a look at these numbers. The federal relief measure includes over $1.1 billion for the state, plus over $500 million for cities and towns, and about $415 million for K through 12 school districts. Now, earlier this week, my colleague Ted Nesi took an in-depth look at this critically important topic. He sat down with mayors, asking them how they plan on spending this money. He also talked to Michael DiBiase. He's the head of RIPEC, which is a business-backed think tank that monitors state spending. Here now is some of Ted's interview with Michael DiBiase.
Mike DiBiase, good to sit down with you, masked because of COVID, but we can still have time to talk. Thank you.
Good to see you, Ted.
So I want to talk about the rescue plan that just passed in Congress and what it means locally for Rhode Island. We are talking about such a large amount of money as someone who covers the budget. We're talking about $1.7 billion plus in direct government aid to the state and the municipalities. Hundreds of millions separately, it looks like, for the K-12 school districts and colleges. All sorts of other grant programs that will flow into specifics, like whether it's child care or whatever. Just a huge amount of money, in my opinion. But you've watched the budget a lot longer than I have. In your perspective, how much money are we talking about here?
It's a massive amount of money for a state like Rhode Island. I saw we were 7th in terms of per capita, how well we did, which is a credit to our congressional delegation. In terms of the budget, I mean, $1.25 billion for state government is equivalent to about 4 months of run of the government. So it's a lot of money. We have almost 4 years to spend it, so we should, try to put that in perspective. But it's definitely a great deal of money, and I think a once in a generation opportunity for Rhode Island.
So before we talk about kind of what to do with it, you mentioned right there, can you just talk a little about your understanding? And I know there's regulations that still have to be written, I think, of how the money, what will be the options, big picture to spend the money, because there was that time pressure last year with the CARES Act money that was talked about a lot. Oh, they extended it, but originally, we got to spend it this year. This is different, right?
There are some rules around it, but it's fairly flexible. It has to respond to the COVID emergency in some way. You can't generally use it to cut taxes. I think you do need to spend it. I don't think we can help the rainy day fund. Maybe there's some kind of a way to do that indirectly, but it has to be spent. So, but in general, it's pretty flexible money.
So there have been, when I look back in history, recent history, some big infusions before. There was the $1.25 billion in the CARES Act that came last year. There was the Obama stimulus. How does what we think is coming in from this compare with those previous big federal investments?
We did get a lot of money early on in COVID, but a great deal of that actually went to the direct response cost, and this is kind of separate from that. So we don't need to spend this money on hospitals and vaccines and testing, and so a lot of that money actually went to the public health emergency directly. So this is different. During the Obama administration, we did receive some funding nowhere near this amount, and some lessons from that time I think are worth thinking about. Some of that money was used to start and expand programs that we then couldn't sustain, and so that's something we should try to avoid if we can.
So, so this money coming in from the Biden plan, as you said, has to be spent, going to get spent somehow. So we've already talked a bit about what not to do with the money. When you talk about, and others have too, one-time investments, things that you could do with this money that would fit both the responsible, not a new program thing that you're talking about, but also, make a real impact, because it's not every day the feds offer to write a check this big to the state. What kinds of things do you think are, what concrete investments do you think might make a difference?
Well, first of all, we should be deliberate because we have some time, and we can learn from other states and cities what they're doing with their money, and also what they've done recently with one-time investments. So I don't think Rhode Island has to totally invent this. I also think the process is extremely important, that we need to broadly engage Rhode Islanders And I hope RIPEC is involved in this, but I'm not the broader Rhode Island. And I think sometimes process is almost as important as the result. And particularly since the people of Rhode Island most affected by the pandemic tend not to be the most powerful and influential. So how do we find out from them what's best for them? So I think that's a key. So with all those qualifications in terms of why they shouldn't just listen to someone like me, I think certainly infrastructure. Our municipalities rank extremely low in capital investment. I think last time I checked, 47th. So things like parks and city centers and maybe community buildings and green space to kind of improve quality of life, fix up some of our public buildings. Another area is broadband and IT. Both government IT, which we lack, but also just general broadband access for our citizens, which we saw was a big problem with K through 12 education. Housing, can we leverage the money to create some incentives to build higher density, low and moderate income housing, which we desperately need and can't seem to do in this state.
What about, I am also going to look at in this story at the local level, because again, I can't say I know the regulations by heart, but some of it's being steered, it seems like, direct to the cities and towns, either the state as a pass-through or maybe they get it directly from the federal government. And as someone who covers both levels of government, frankly, sometimes I worry a little more about municipal level spending because there's fewer reporters now at city halls, and just sometimes there's less sophistication in finance offices than at the state level. What do you think when you think about the city and town money? Providence getting $130 million, for example.
Yeah, it's really interesting because other cities did get the COVID money, but the only government we had big enough was Providence County. We didn't have a government in it, so we didn't get none of them got the money of the first round. I am concerned that they're not used to having a lot of extra money. I think they'd be wise to perhaps partner with the state on the compliance side or partner with each other so that because there's a fair amount of compliance and reporting that they just don't have the capacity for. I do think it's a great opportunity. I mentioned infrastructure. We don't perhaps realize this 47th ranking, but we usually don't rank so low spending money. Our cities and towns are set up to not spend very much on capital. That's why our schools were falling down. That's why a lot of roads are not very good. And I think this is a big opportunity for them to catch up on a lot of infrastructure, public buildings. So I think their needs are maybe more in front of them than the state needs are. And city centers, a lot of things that I think mayors and town managers have wanted to do that they can now do. So I hope a lot of it goes into infrastructure, broadband, things like that.
Do you think the same approach toward the money you talk about the state level, the process, engaging people before you start to write checks or make commitments with it, is what the cities and towns should be thinking about? I
think they definitely should, although I think they're closer to the people already. So I think a lot of that they will get a lot of that input. But I do think this is a hard issue for a community. How do you bring in those? And we know that it was people who are economically and socially disadvantaged that most suffered from the pandemic. They are receiving a fair amount of relief, but how do we make these investments work for them too and work for the whole state? I think we got to remember that returning back to pre-pandemic is not great for Rhode Island. I mean, we had full employment, but we had a lot of low-wage, low-skilled jobs. We still have the highest poverty rate in New England. So, I mean, there are, I don't think we want to just restore. I think we want to try to get to another level.
I was wondering if you've looked back much at most of the $1.25 billion from the Coronavirus Relief Fund in the CARES Act has been allocated or spent. Do you have any overall impression right now on how well or not that money was spent? As you say, a lot of it did go to pretty direct response things like testing costs.
Rhode Island did get a lot of money. I think there was a fair amount that went out to business, but the sense was that there wasn't a great deal of happiness among the business community. So I think, part of what Governor McKee is trying to do is, can he make that easier, more effective?
It does feel like there was a mismatch between, when I look at the totals, I know a lot was allocated towards some business relief funds. People found it painful to get it, and so it didn't feel, and maybe they just found it wasn't right once they got it too.
For some reason, there's some disconnect there, and I'm not sure. I think, rental assistance, was a struggle, even though a lot of money went out. There is, of all the amount of allocations, that seems to be more money than can possibly spend on rental assistance. It just seems like so much money is coming in, which is great.
Another 200 just came in December.
We should maximize it, but we got to find a different way to use that money. It's just so much money. So I don't think I'm prepared to make a judgment. I will say that state government took care of itself first with the COVID money, and
not the first time I've seen that.
Now a lot of that is, a lot of government programs are for people, and they go to their providers, but it certainly the government workforce and things like that went. But a lot of that money did go to the direct costs. And we spent a great deal of money on hospitals and testing and things like that were the right places to put the money.
Last question. We just wanted to get, you've touched on it a few times already, but want to have a full-on question about it. Governor McKee's budget proposal came out Thursday. You've already commented a little about it. What are the pros, what are the cons that you see in that proposal?
I think it was relatively conservative, which is good. It did not worsen our structural deficit, which is good. So I don't have a lot to quarrel with it. I do think further cutting the car tax was questionable. That was essentially done with federal money, and it may not violate the letter of the new federal law, but certainly violates the spirit of it. I do think taxing the PPP loans was also something that I would question. That was those were federal grants. The federal government's not taxing it. Most states aren't taxing it. So I would hope, and I know the governor mentioned that if there was some additional funding, he would perhaps reverse that. He didn't do the whole thing. He only did a partial amount. About half. And I do think he tackled things like Eleanor Slater Hospital, probation. He went after some things that I think were important. So all in all, he only had 9 days to put it together. So I think what I liked is that it did not worsen our structural picture, which he could have done if he wanted to be more aggressive, and I'm glad he didn't.
I break down the week in news, including where things stand with Governor Dan McKee's pick for Lieutenant Governor. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News Politics editor Ted Nesi. Ted, I want to pick up where we left off on the first half, and that is the American Recovery Act money. As we talked about in the first half, more than $1 billion coming to Rhode Island, $1.1 billion to the state, some $500 million to cities and towns, and $415 million to K through 12 school districts. We know these numbers because of your report earlier this week, which you can catch on WPRI.com. And I remember when you were considering doing this story, you noted to me that normally we look at this type of massive federal spending after the money has been spent, and you thought it was really, really important to take a look at all of this and the decision making that will go into it before the money even lands in Rhode Island.
Yeah, I think it's easy to do the follow the money story. Well, not always easy actually, but we do the follow the money story. Unfortunately, if something's misspent, we'll do that story, and that is part of our job. But so much money is coming in. I thought it was important for people to sort of start to wrap their minds around both citizens, officials, and at all levels of government. That's the other thing. It's not just the governor this time like it was with Gina Raimondo and that COVID money. School committees are going to need to make significant spending decisions around this money. So I think it's really important people are paying attention, aware, asking questions of their city council, asking questions of school committee, of course, their lawmakers in the governor's office, because it's a lot of money which presents both opportunity and opportunity to waste it.
Yeah, and you, I know as you were reporting this one out, one of the main themes that at least I got from our discussions was how important a lot of the people you talked to felt that public engagement should be a big part of how this is spent. And we saw that right after your report on social media. There were some people who chafed at the idea of how Mayor Elorza wanted to spend the money on some different platforms for restaurants. That may or may not happen.
Right.
It depends, but it was interesting to see that reaction to your report, and that, I guess, fortifies what you heard. Public engagement is key.
Yeah, and also giving people the information up front so they're not surprised later to find out how much did my town get and what did we spend it on. I hope people see that and they check, they ask, they look, they go to town meeting, however it's handled.
Because this won't be voted on in a bond.
No, it won't, and it's going to probably get rolled into the regular budget process in most places. And, there are a couple of years to go, but the money's supposed to start to come in May. So decisions will start to be made pretty quickly. We've also seen times before where large amounts of money was squandered that maybe if there was a bit more public engagement, if the officials felt a little more pressure to do their homework before they made those decisions, better decisions would have been made. So hopefully Rhode Island will be, could be a leader in being smart about using this, even if at times in the past I can understand why viewers might be, they have 38 studios in their head or something, be a little worried about the track record in the state.
Well, let's zoom out now and head to Washington. Our colleagues Kim Kalunian and Brian Yacono interviewed Senator Sheldon Whitehouse on 12 News at 4. And Brian asked the senator how the country would recover, or how could it recover from the cost of a $1.9 trillion recovery plan. Here's what Whitehouse had to say.
Well, the evidence that we have from people who are far smarter than I about macroeconomics and all of that, like our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, is that when the economy is headed into a problem, like we have had a really massive problem with families way behind on rent, way behind on mortgage payments, way behind on basic upkeep and maintenance, and in many cases in dire economic circumstances, that can drag the country down into a very, very bad economic situation, whereas a sudden, really strong surge of support for those families can boost us across the chasm and get us into a good, bright economic future. And that's the theory. It's that you're paying now for the boost that comes once that money hits the streets and people have the ability to restore their family life and get themselves back on their feet again.
So that was more of the senator, I think, Ted, defending the bill itself, the $1.9 trillion. But there are very real concerns about inflation and all the cost of this deficit spending.
Yeah, I pulled some numbers this morning as I was working my weekend column about this piece, and it is striking. I mean, the federal debt's now over 100% of the size of the economy, which is basically back to World War II levels, which was historic. That said, there is one other piece that I think is important for people to think about. Just if you think about your own mortgage, both sides of the mortgage matter. How much of a mortgage you took, but the interest rate. If you have an 18% interest mortgage like the 80s, that's very different from the 3 to 4% people are getting today. And the country's actually spending less on interest payments on the debt now than it was in 2000 when debt was much lower. That was after the boom of the 1990s. So I do think there's multiple factors at play. I'm not saying by any means we shouldn't be keeping a close eye on the deficits and the debts and everything, but I also think the interest rate situation is as unusual as the debt. So there's a lot of moving pieces to that. But these are huge sums of money. There's just no way around that.
Yeah, and inflation is driven primarily by supply and demand. So, we'll see how this thing plays out. Let's get back to Rhode Island and the ever-running saga of Governor McKee's choice for lieutenant governor. I will steal your joke, who gets the rose on this one. And we learned this week that there are finalists for the choice of lieutenant governor, and you can see them on your screen. Councilwoman Sabina Matos, former Central Falls Mayor James DiBiase. We also have on there Democratic National Committee woman Liz Beretta Perrick, State Senator Lou DePalma, as well as State Rep Grace Diaz. So what do we know? I mean, what week can you and I stop talking about this?
Well, the governor said he's going to pick in the next few weeks. I mean, the switch from 10 candidates to 5 came very quickly. So it seems like they are trying to move on getting this done. I mean, McKee himself, when he was here with us on this show last week, called it awkward, the process. I don't think he and his, initial team, which was pretty skeletal when he was first found out he would be governor, maybe thought through what it would be like to go through weeks and weeks of this reality show of who's going to get it. But all the names on the list right now, I think, are credible contenders to get it. I think, you see there, I think it's 3 women, 2 men. You have multiple, you have 2 Latinas and James DiBiase, who's Latino. You have Lou DePalma, who's a Senate leader. He's from Aquidneck Island. Liz Beretta Perrick, not someone who's been in elected office before, but very prominent in elite Democratic circles, partly as a party fundraiser. So whoever McKee picks really will tell us a lot about what he and his team are thinking, both what he wants in the lieutenant governor's office right now, but also who he thinks is helpful to him to try to win the election next year.
Quick, do you think there'll be a big push for a combined ticket?
I think so. I mean, there's a bill pending in the Assembly. McKee supports it. But, one downside for some ambitious lawmakers who see themselves in higher office when that vote comes up is they imagine maybe they'll want to run for, Dan McKee didn't need to partner with Gina Raimondo to become lieutenant governor. Dan McKee would not.
I don't think that would have been the ticket.
Well, that's what I mean. Dan McKee would not be the governor today if his policy on LG and Gov were together, because Gina Raimondo just wouldn't have been picking him to be her number 2. So it's, Dan McKee shows why it can be quite beneficial not to run with the governor.
All right. I want to get to now to the vaccine rollout in Rhode Island. And as some of you may recall, Target 12 asked Harvard University earlier this year to grade Rhode Island for its vaccine rollout. And it was not the type of report card that you would put on mom's refrigerator. The state got an F. So we went back almost 2 months later and asked Harvard to take another look. And it was a much better report card, an overall B grade for Rhode Island. And that ranked the state 6th in the country for vaccine distribution per capita and 11th in the nation for percentage of doses used. Dan McKee was very quick to point out the Target 12 report in this week's press briefing. Take a listen.
I'm glad to say that Harvard University upgraded Rhode Island's rating vaccine distribution from an F, and they gave us in early February to a B today, and we're going to continue to help improve that grade across any metrics that are out there that we're being measured by. It's good news for people in Rhode Island. They should be encouraged by the progress that our state has made, and I thank Dr. Alexander Scott and the COVID response team who worked with us to speed up this distribution.
It struck me, Ted, that Governor McKee is a political creature, right? And I interviewed Dr. James McDonald, the medical director of the Department of Health, for that report, and he was very quick to point out, look, that's academia. Mm-hmm. We don't care about grades. Right. He had a very dramatic line. What I care about is saving lives. Mm-hmm. But Dan McKee jumped right on that letter grade.
I mean, Dan McKee doesn't mind, the fact that he became governor and the vaccine distribution looks much better right now.
But how much credit can he take?
Well, and that's the question, right? Gina Raimondo's people point out that, the uptick really began when she was still in office, and they argue they were always planning to shift from their hyper-targeted initial strategy to mass vaccination site. But McKee maintains that when he got into those meetings, there wasn't a plan in place yet to get that done as fast as it wound up happening. So, I also think regardless of who the governor was, look at Massachusetts, where they also were lagging initially, and they've ramped it up really fast, and there's been no transition there. So it's also just the pressure that comes. I think both Rhode Island and Massachusetts felt the pressure partly from Connecticut, which has been a leader the entire time, and people in these 2 states said, hey, why can't we keep up with our neighbor?
So sticking with vaccines, a story that almost got lost this week, but was such a big deal several months ago, and that was the revelation several months ago that board members of Lifespan and Care New England received vaccines. The Attorney General launched and this was right at the beginning when it was supposed to go to frontline healthcare workers. The AG launched an inquiry. His report came out this week. The AG found that the hospitals did not break any laws or policies, and that was largely because the AG thought the Department of Health didn't really define who should get those vaccinations. But Nerona did chastise them for the decision. That's a bad look, I would say, for the hospitals. And my question to you, as someone who's watching the merger with about a minute left here, is it bad timing?
Certainly. I think, this is not the time they need bad PR. They're trying to convince Rhode Islanders to trust them, the leaders of Lifespan and Care New England, to create this hospital monolith in the state. And that might be the right idea, but people have a lot of valid concerns about the level of power they will have. And when you're asking for even more power, you want to show you're using your current power wisely, responsibly, in a civic-minded way. And that was clearly not what most people felt. And I thought it was interesting, Dr. Alexander Scott, the health department director, in the briefing made a comment to the point that we told them to give it to who they said they needed to get vaccinated to keep the hospitals operating. We didn't think that would be board members. It is unusual in the sort of happy talk healthcare world to actually be that critical. And remember, she needs to approve the merger. So I think they have a little cleaning up to do on their reputation from that. But they'll be happy to think that they didn't break any laws and they can move on.
All right, as I mentioned at the start of the show, Ted did an in-depth look on all of that Biden money that's coming to the state and how that breaks down. You can watch that on WPRI.com. If you missed this episode, it's also online. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.